All right. Buckle up, because this deep dive is taking us into some seriously contested territory.
Oh, yeah.
You wanted to explore Christianity and Islam, right? Their whole historical relationship, especially when it comes to the Crusades.
Right.
So we cracked open Robert Spencer's politically incorrect guide to Islam and the Crusades to see what he has to say.
Okay, so before we get into it, gotta lay down a major disclaimer here. Spencer, just one dude, one perspective on a very, and I mean very complicated history.
Totally.
And trust me, people have some thoughts about his perspective.
Exactly. Lots of debate. So we're here to unpack his arguments, not to say this is the be-all and end-all of truth about Islam or the Crusades.
Right, yeah. Definitely not.
Think of us as, like, guides through this potentially explosive material.
Yeah.
So who is Robert Spencer? In a nutshell, American author, known for, well, let's just say he's not afraid to criticize Islam, like, at all. His main argument in this book, get this massive cover-up happening, huge one, about the real nature of Islam, apparently. Claims American Muslim groups are, like, downplaying some pretty major stuff about Islamic doctrine, about history, the whole 9 yards.
And it doesn't stop there.
Oh, there's more.
Oh, yeah. He connects all this alleged cover-up stuff, right, to what's going on today, like right now. Says that modern-day jihadist movements, same driving forces as the guys who fought in the Crusades centuries ago.
Whoa. Okay, so that's a big claim right there. Anything else?
Oh, there's more. He also flips the script, totally flips it, on how we usually see the Crusades.
How so?
Says they were defensive.
Defensive.
Yeah, it's a defensive response to, get this, centuries of Muslims being the aggressors, pushing on Christendom. Now, that's a bold statement if I've ever heard one.
It's a huge statement. Okay, so to even start wrapping our heads around that, we got to rewind way back.
Way back.
To the very beginning. To the founder himself, Muhammad. Right. So Spencer, he's not holding back.
Yeah.
He portrays Muhammad not just as, you know, the prophet, but also as a military leader, like full-on general leading armies into battle.
Yeah.
Ordered assassinations, instilled this whole, like, doctrine of jihad in his followers, according to Spencer.
Yeah, Spencer, he really focuses on, like, the more action-packed parts of Muhammad's life, you could say.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. What's an example?
Okay, so he talks about this super intense scene. It's after the Battle of Uhud, right? Muhammad's wounded, like seriously wounded, blood everywhere. And instead of, you know, offering forgiveness, he's like vowing revenge.
Intense.
Yeah. And that battle, Uhud, it's important for another reason too.
What's that?
It comes after the Muslims had this like crazy victory, Battle of Badr. I mean, they were totally outnumbered, but they won big time. And Spencer's argument is that this win, this impossible win, it convinced a lot of those early Muslims that God, like, literally was fighting on their side. And that, according to Spencer, that shaped everything, how they thought about war, about conquering, the whole deal.
Okay, so we're seeing a pattern here. If we're talking fighting wars, we got to talk about the Quran, right?
Right.
Spencer spends a good chunk of the book, like a big chunk, pointing out all these verses in the Quran that, let's be honest, straight up call for violence against people who aren't believers.
Yep.
And he's not being subtle about it. He's like, chapter this, verse that, boom, 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 dropping truth bombs left and right.
See, and that's where his argument gets even more specific. He brings up this whole concept of abrogation.
Abrogation? What's that?
Basically the idea that some verses in the Quran, they're like overrides. They cancel out the earlier verses.
Okay, so later verses trump earlier ones.
Yeah, like a hierarchy. And guess which chapter is believed to be the last one revealed, according to, you know, Islamic tradition?
I'm guessing not the most peaceful one.
Bingo. Surah 9. The one packed with the most, let's just say, intense verses about dealing with non-believers.
So context is everything, huh?
According to Spencer, yeah, big time. And he doesn't start with the Quran. He then takes this whole historical, theological framework, right? And he's like, let's see how Muslims and non-Muslims have actually gotten along throughout history.
And how'd that go?
Well, he argues that this golden age everyone talks about, the peaceful Islamic rule, more like everyone had to be quiet, like enforced silence. He calls it dhimitude.
Dhimitude. Okay, first time I'm hearing that word. Break it down for me.
So dhimmi, that was the status of anyone not Muslim living under Islamic rule.
Gotcha.
And Spencer's like, this wasn't about everyone getting along. He says it was about subjugation.
Subjugation? Wow. Strong word.
Right. He points to things like the jizya tax, which was this special tax just for non-Muslims. And then there were dress codes, all these rules about what you could and couldn't say about Islam.
So not exactly a free-for-all.
Not exactly. He paints a pretty intense picture, claims this whole Dhimma system, it built up centuries of resentment that eventually, boom, Crusades.
Right. Which is not really how you hear it usually told.
Exactly. And that is Spencer's whole point. He's like, wake up, people.
Right.
He wants to challenge that dominant narrative, the one where the Crusades were this random out-of-the-blue attack from Europe.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying, nope, look at the centuries of Muslim conquest that came before that.
He even digs up some pretty obscure stuff. Like, way before any European crusaders showed up, you had those early Muslim sieges of Constantinople, right? Back in
Yeah.
the 7th, 8th centuries.
Oh, yeah, he brings those up. And that's how he builds his case. It's all connected, see, the Crusades. A delayed response, he says, sure. But a response nonetheless to all that, what he sees as aggression, as Islam spreading and spreading.
Okay, so that's Islam and the West, historically speaking, according to Spencer. Anything else?
Oh, there's always more. He gets into some really hot-button topics that are happening right now, like right now, especially this whole Islamophobia thing.
Oh, boy, yeah.
And let me tell you, he does not hold back. Says people throw that word around to shut down any criticism of Islam, even if it's totally legit. And he's really concerned about this, like, chilling effect on free speech. Like, people are so scared of being called Islamophobic that they won't even talk about, like, legitimate concerns they might have about, certain aspects of Islam, even in the West.
He's pretty critical of organizations like PRIAR, right?
Oh, yeah.
But
PRIAR, the Council on American Islamic Relations, big time. He says they use this Islamophobia accusation as a way to just shut down any debate instead of actually, having a conversation.
I remember him mentioning a specific example from Australia.
Oh, yeah. The case with that Christian preacher.
Right.
The guy got in trouble, ended up convicted for inciting religious hatred just because of stuff he said in his sermons about Islam. And Spencer uses that case to show how, even in Western countries where we're supposed to have all this freedom of speech, the legal systems are being used to, like, silence anyone who's critical of Islam.
Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
Mm.
Where do you draw the line between criticizing something and straight-up hate speech?
Yeah.
And when it comes to religion, how much free speech is too much?
Big questions, man. Big questions. And honestly, those go way beyond just Spencer's book. That's a whole other deep dive right there. But Spencer's point is, all this fear of being labeled Islamophobic, it's preventing us from having real, honest conversations about important issues.
And those issues, if you believe Spencer, they're not just some abstract thing. They have very real, potentially dangerous consequences in the real world.
Yeah, like what?
Well, he argues that by not facing what he calls the uncomfortable truths about Islam, we're basically leaving ourselves vulnerable. Like, he points at cases where law enforcement, because they don't want to appear Islamophobic, they'll ignore or downplay warning signs, even when it comes to potential terrorist activity.
Oh, like that thing with the FBI?
Exactly. The LA airport shooting, they dismissed it as workplace violence, remember? And then, boom, turns out the guy had ties to Al-Qaeda.
Wow.
Spencer uses that to argue that being so afraid of seeming biased, ironically, it can make us less safe. So, long story short, Spencer's saying Islam and the West, fundamentally incompatible, different values, different worldviews. He says, wake up West, or we're headed for a clash of civilizations.
That's quite the warning.
Yeah, it's a stark warning. And he doesn't just leave it at that. He's got a whole call to action, which I guess we'll get into after the break. Okay, so we're back. And Spencer didn't pull any punches in that last part, huh?
Not exactly.
Painting a pretty stark picture of Islam and the West, especially that whole clash of civilizations thing.
Yeah, and I remember that whole comparison he made about Islam never having its Reformation moment like Christianity.
Right, like Islam missed the memo or something.
Oh, it's a catchy soundbite, but to be honest, it's a comparison that needs, like, a whole lot of unpacking. Like, what are we even talking about when we say Reformation, and how did that whole thing actually go down in Christianity?
Okay, so, like, history lesson time.
History lesson time.
Hit me with it. Reformation 101. What made it such a big deal?
Okay, imagine Europe, right? But like way back in the 1500s, you've got the Catholic Church. It's this massive, powerful force. I mean, we're talking politics, culture, even people's everyday lives. The church had its hands in everything.
Right.
But, and this is but underneath all that, people are starting to get restless. They're questioning the church's authority, whispering about corruption. And some are even wondering if the church has strayed from its, spiritual core.
And that's where Martin Luther comes in, right? Like, bam, 95 Theses, nailed to the church door. What was his beef?
Indulgences. He was furious about indulgences. Basically, the church was selling forgiveness, like pay up and your sins are gone. Luther thought that was a note of, well, he believed that salvation came from faith, from your personal relationship with God, not from how much money you could shell out.
So it's a theological debate, but with huge real-world implications.
Oh, absolutely. Luther's ideas, they spread like wildfire thanks to that newfangled printing press. And people, they were ready for change. They wanted to read the Bible for themselves, in their own language, not just Latin, which no one understood except the priests.
Right.
And this is where things get really interesting. This desire for a more direct connection with God, it leads to the emergence of Protestant denominations. So now you've got a whole new challenge to the Catholic Church's authority.
And of course, cue the religious wars.
Yeah, unfortunately, it wasn't exactly a peaceful transition. The Reformation got messy, violent even, but it also left a huge mark on Western civilization. We're talking religious freedom, the idea that you get to choose what you believe, which is something we take for granted now. It even planted the seeds for democracy, for challenging authority in general. And some would even say it helped pave the way for modern science by encouraging people to think critically, to question everything.
Okay, now I see what Spencer's getting at with this comparison. He's saying Islam missed out on that whole questioning authority, breaking free from the past thing.
Exactly. He argues that without that Reformation shakeup, Islam is stuck in this medieval mindset. It can't handle modern values like individual liberty, secularism, the stuff the West is built on, according to him.
Right.
Yeah.
But isn't that a bit of a stretch, like a really big stretch?
Yeah.
The Muslim world is huge, diverse. You can't just lump over a billion people with different cultures, traditions, interpretations of Islam into one big category. It's just not accurate.
I agree with you. And that's one of the main criticisms of Spencer's whole argument. It's way too simplistic. It's like saying all of Christianity is the same because, they share a book. It just doesn't reflect the real world, the way people actually live their faith.
So no monolithic Islam. Got it. But, I mean, Spencer does make some points that are, hard to ignore. He talks about the treatment of women in some Muslim-majority countries, religious minorities. Those are real issues.
Definitely real and incredibly important. But even with those issues, we have to be careful about jumping to conclusions. Yes, there are places where women's rights are suppressed, where religious minorities face discrimination, where dissent is silenced. But those problems aren't unique to the Muslim world. And they're not necessarily because of something inherently wrong with Islam itself.
Okay, so if it's not Islam, then what's driving those issues?
It's complicated. I mean, you're talking about centuries of history, political power struggles, economic inequalities, cultural interpretations of religion. It's a whole tangled mess. To point the finger solely at Islam, that's just lazy thinking.
That's fair. But I think what Spencer's trying to say, maybe clumsily, is that Islam hasn't really confronted modernity in the same way Christianity has. Like, maybe there's something about Islam that makes it harder to change to adapt to the modern world.
That's his claim, for sure. But it's one that a lot of scholars and Muslims themselves would strongly disagree with. There's a long history of debate and reform within Islam, going all the way back to the early centuries after Muhammad.
Really? I didn't know that. So if Spencer's wrong about this whole lack of reform thing, what are some examples of movements within Islam that have challenged the status quo, that have tried to change things from within?
Well, have you ever heard of the Mu'tazilites?
Can't say that I have.
They were this fascinating group of Islamic thinkers way back in the 8th century. And get this, their big thing was reason. They were all about logic, free will. Imagine, back then, arguing that God's justice means humans have to have the ability to choose between right and wrong. That was a radical idea.
Wow, I bet. I'm guessing that didn't go over so well with everyone.
You're right about that. They faced pushback from the more traditional scholars who thought relying too much on reason was basically disrespecting the Quran. But for a while, they were pretty influential. And even though they eventually faded out, their ideas had a lasting impact, sparking all these important debates about the role of reason within Islamic thought.
So even if they didn't change the whole system, they at least got the conversation going.
Exactly. And it shows that questioning tradition, trying to reconcile faith with reason, it's not a new thing in Islam. It's been happening for centuries.
Okay, so that's one example. What else? Who else should we be putting on our Islamic Reformation all-star team?
Well, any discussion about reform within Islam has to include Sufism.
Oh, yeah, the Sufis.
Yeah.
Whirling dervishes, mystical poetry, focusing on the heart. That's Sufism, right?
That's one way to think about it. But at its core, Sufism is all about a direct personal experience of the divine. It's about seeking a deep mystical connection with God through things like meditation, chanting, poetry, music even. They weren't as concerned with outward rituals or legalistic interpretations of Islam. They were more about the inner journey, the heart-to-heart connection with the divine.
I like it. Less about rules and more about feeling it, yeah.
Yeah.
But how does that make them reformers?
Well, they often challenge the authority of the ulama, the traditional religious scholars. You see, the Sufis believed that a genuine connection with God was available to everyone, regardless of your social status or how much you knew about Islamic law.
So, like, democratizing spirituality, making it accessible to the people.
You got it. They were also big on tolerance and understanding between different religions. They believed that all faiths were just different paths leading to the same truth, the same God. And that put them at odds with some of the more hardline, exclusivist interpretations of Islam that were around back then.
Fascinating. So we've got reason-based reformers, we've got mystical seekers. It seems like Islamic history is a lot more nuanced and diverse than Spencer makes it out to be.
Absolutely. These are just two examples, but they show that Islam isn't some monolithic, unchanging thing. It's a dynamic faith that has always had its share of disagreements, calls for change, and attempts to adapt to the times.
So to say that Islam has never had a reformation might be technically true if we're talking about one massive upheaval, but that definitely doesn't mean there haven't been reform movements and calls for change throughout Islamic history.
Exactly. It's more accurate to say that Islam has gone through a series of reform movements, maybe more localized, less dramatic than the Protestant Reformation, but still incredibly important in shaping how the faith has evolved. And that evolution is still happening today, maybe even more so now than ever before.
Okay, so that brings us to the present. What does this struggle between tradition and change look like in the modern Islamic world? Where do things stand now?
That is the million-dollar question, and it's a question we're going to dive into right after we come back from a quick break.
All right, so we're back. And we've been on this deep dive into Islam, trying to make sense of this whole idea of reform, especially in the context of what's going on in the world today.
And it's a conversation that's impossible to have without acknowledging the very real, very serious challenges facing the Muslim world right now. I mean, we're talking poverty, political instability, the rise of extremism. It's a lot.
Right, like those issues are front and center.
Exactly. And for a lot of Muslims, especially the younger generation, it's forcing them to ask some tough questions, Like, how do we reconcile our faith with what's happening in the world? How do we find solutions that are true to our values, but also allow us to engage with the 21st century?
So it's like this perfect storm that's pushing some within Islam
Yeah.
to take a second look at how they've always understood things and search for new answers, new ways forward.
That's a great way to put it. It sparked a real surge in reformist thinking.
Mm.
Scholars, activists, even just everyday Muslims, they're all calling for change, for reinterpreting tradition in a way that's relevant to the modern world. And what's really interesting is the role technology is playing in all of this.
Oh, yeah. We were talking about that earlier. It's like a whole new ballgame with the internet, social media, all of that.
It's huge. Think about it. Someone in Indonesia can have a theological debate with a scholar in Egypt in real time. Women in Saudi Arabia can listen to lectures by female Islamic scholars they'd never have access to otherwise.
So it's like technology is creating this space where people can bypass the traditional gatekeepers, the ones who used to decide who gets to say what about Islam.
Exactly. It's democratizing knowledge, creating a much more dynamic and diverse conversation about the future of Islam than we've ever seen before.
Which is super interesting to think about, especially in light of Spencer's argument that Islam is inherently resistant to change. It seems like change is happening maybe faster than ever, even if it's not always coming from the top down.
Right, and that's a really important point. This isn't just about some elite group of scholars sitting in a room debating theology. This is about everyday Muslims engaging with their faith in new and exciting ways.
So if we're talking about a modern-day reform movement, who are some of the names, the thinkers that are shaping this conversation?
Well, it's not like there's one leader or spokesperson for the whole movement. It's more like a tapestry of voices, each with their own unique perspective. But one name you definitely hear a lot is Amina Wadud. She's an Islamic scholar who's been a real trailblazer, especially when it comes to advocating for women's rights within Islam.
Oh, yeah. Wasn't she the one who got in hot water a few years back for leading that mixed gender prayer service?
That's the one. It caused a huge uproar, but it also ignited this incredibly important conversation about the role of women in Islam, a conversation that continues today. Wadud is all about reinterpreting those traditional texts through a more egalitarian lens, challenging centuries of patriarchal interpretations.
That's amazing. I'm curious, what about on the, I don't know, less controversial side of things?
hmm
Are there reformers out there who are focusing more on how Islam can adapt to a globalized world, how to bridge the gap between Islam and the West?
Absolutely. One figure who comes to mind is Tariq Ramadan. He's a Swiss Islamic theologian who's done a lot of work on this idea of a European Islam. Basically, he argues that Muslims can be fully integrated into Western societies without having to give up their religious or cultural identity.
Okay, I can see how that would be a really appealing message for a lot of Muslims living in the West. But I imagine it's not always easy to reconcile those two worlds. Like, how do you balance traditional Islamic values with the values of a more secular society, like, say, France or Germany?
You're hitting on a really important tension there, and it's one that these reformers are constantly navigating. They face criticism from both sides.
Mm.
You have conservative religious authorities accusing them of being too accommodating, of watering down the faith. And then you have some people in the West who are suspicious of them, wondering if they're really committed to things like democracy and gender equality.
So it's a constant balancing act, trying to find that middle ground.
Exactly. And it takes a lot of courage to put yourself out there, to challenge the status quo, knowing you're going to be attacked from all sides.
It makes you realize this isn't just an academic exercise. These reformers are putting themselves on the line, often at great personal risk, to try to make the world a better place.
That's exactly it. They're fighting for basic human rights, for a more just and equitable world. And they're doing it in a context where speaking out can have serious consequences.
We were talking about technology a minute ago, and I'm curious, have you seen any examples of, like, online movements or initiatives that are contributing to this reform conversation?
Oh, absolutely. There are countless examples. You have online platforms dedicated to feminist interpretations of Islam, websites where young Muslims can ask questions about their faith anonymously,
Yeah.
even virtual reality experiences that allow people to explore different Islamic traditions and practices.
That's wild. It really shows you how technology is breaking down barriers and opening up new possibilities for how people connect with their faith, their culture, and each other.
It's pretty amazing to witness. And it's one of the reasons why I'm cautiously optimistic about the future of Islam, despite all the challenges. I think we're at a really pivotal moment.
Okay, so I'm hearing some hope here, some optimism. But I have to ask, what about Spencer's warning? He seems pretty convinced that Islam and the West are on a collision course. Is he right? Is a clash of civilizations inevitable?
I don't think so. Not inevitably, but I do think it's a real possibility if we don't actively choose a different path. If we allow fear, ignorance, and simplistic narratives to guide our actions, then yes, we're headed down a dangerous road. But if we choose dialogue over demonization, if we focus on our shared humanity rather than our differences, then I think a different future is possible. One where Islam and the West can coexist peacefully and even thrive together.
That's a future I think we can all get behind. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Robert Spencer's book, what are some key takeaways you hope our listeners will walk away with?
Well, first and foremost, I hope they'll remember that Spencer is just one voice, one perspective on a very complex and multifaceted topic. It's important to seek out alternative viewpoints, to do your own research, and to engage with this topic with an open mind and a critical eye.
Totally. Don't just take Spencer's word for it, or even our word for it. Do your own digging. Talk to Muslims in your community, explore different perspectives, and come to your own conclusions.
Exactly. And remember that Islam, like any major world religion, is incredibly diverse. It's full of different interpretations, different schools of thought, different cultural expressions. To reduce it to a single monolithic entity is not only inaccurate, but also incredibly dangerous.
Right. Those stereotypes, those sweeping generalizations, they just don't reflect the reality of the Muslim world. And they certainly don't help us build bridges of understanding.
And at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, isn't it? Building bridges, fostering understanding, and remembering that we're all in this together, regardless of our differences.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, folks, that's a wrap on our deep dive into Robert Spencer's politically incorrect guide to Islam and the Crusades. It's been a wild ride full of history, controversy, and hopefully some food for thought.
We always say it, but we really mean it. Keep those conversations going. Talk to each other, challenge your assumptions, and never stop learning.
And on that note, we'll catch you next time for another deep dive into the world of ideas.